Hey folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I'm doing yet another edition of the weekly Q&A series about freelancing. I've actually gotten a haircut and cleaned myself up a little bit, so hopefully that helps with engagement. But I kind of assume you're not here for the eye candy. You're probably just here to learn a little bit about freelancing, so let's get into that. The question that I have today is, do you need a bookkeeper to freelance? And if so, when should you hire one? So this is one that I can answer a little more readily. I would argue that for freelancing, you probably never need to hire a bookkeeper. And I think all things being equal, and I'll get into some nuance here in a bit, but all things being equal, I probably wouldn't make a hire for this. You would never really need this in a freelancing role. And the reason I say that, admittedly with a little bit of a caveat here, is the expenses and invoicing the books for a freelancer are so dead simple that most of those of you watching, especially given that the audience for this is going to skew heavily technical and at the risk of generalizing, you're probably pretty good with STEM. The ledger for bookkeeping for a freelancer is quite simple. You'll send out invoices generally for services. So somebody contracts you to do app dev for a couple months, and you say, all right, I'm going to charge you $10,000 a month for doing app dev, and you send out an invoice, maybe hopefully up front, if not after the fact. So you do a month worth of app dev, and then you send an invoice for $10,000. Now, what you're going to need to do at the most basic level in the realm of bookkeeping is send out that invoice and then keep track of whether the invoice has been paid or not. This concept is known as accounts receivable for you, meaning you have sent out a request for payment. It's receivable if they owe it to you and haven't paid yet. If they pay it, then it's just paid. So in that sense, the entirety of your bookkeeping can really be done in a spreadsheet if you are so inclined. And it's just keeping track of the work that you've done. If and when you've sent an invoice, when you should make note of when you send an invoice, and then when you receive that invoice. And then you're going to want to either manually or through some automated process sync whatever you're doing up with your actual bank account. So that's really all there is to it. And you could hire a bookkeeper, I suppose, but it's just so straightforward, especially in the beginning, that unless you, and I'll kind of go into this in a moment, but unless you really struggle with these concepts, that it's going to be too much firepower for what you're doing. Now, the other side of the ledger is you might be wondering about, what about expenses for my business? Typically in a service-based business, especially if you're working as a freelancer, in the beginning, you're not going to have a lot in the way of expenses. Maybe you're paying every year for hosting for a website. That's kind of the only one I can think of if you're going to pay for that. You might pay for something like Sales Navigator on LinkedIn, certain things to do prospecting, certain expenses. And again, you can have a credit card associated with your bank account and then just keep track of your expenses in a spreadsheet and, sync that up with your bank account for the sake of double entry. You could just have a bank account and log in and see how you're doing, because you could always export expenses and accounts receivable from, you would need some kind of invoicing paradigm. But anyway, so if you have some invoicing software like Mint or whatever, and you have a bank account, it's pretty easy to export anything that your CPA might want. So it's really pretty easy, and you could conceptually do all of this with a spreadsheet or a piece of paper. And there just isn't much nuance to your finances. You have a pretty limited set of expenses. You sell your labor often to a single client at a time, so there's not a lot of accounts receivable typically for your average freelancer to keep track of. So there just isn't much to it. Let me talk a little bit, I guess, about hiring in general, though. So the question here is sort of a microcosm of decisions that you might have to make as you grow your practice and maybe eventually start an equity type of business. And so you're talking about hiring, and usually there's this kind of continuum or spectrum that you'll go through when it comes to hiring. So the first thing you'll probably do is spend a little bit of money working with a vendor. That's the most natural kind of hiring. So a good example of this is a CPA, which by the CPA for taxes. So in the U.S., paying someone to do your taxes, that I would not do yourself for what it's worth. I mean, you can, I guess, if you have a pass-through entity, but that's a good, thing to do. And that's a very standard expense. It's a very fixed scope expense where you're working with an expert. And that's what I mean by a vendor. So one of the first hires you'll do for your business is things of that nature, where you go and pay an expert for a very small amount of time or effort or scope project in order to do something that you're really, unequipped to do. That's the first kind of hire that you might make. As you go along, you might start to do hires like, say, to build a website or something where you're more versed in what's going on, and it's a bit more of a nuanced hire. You're not saying, hey, expert, please help me with a very limited scope of engagement. Instead, you're saying, hey, vendor about which I somewhat understand what you do, or maybe a lot understand what you do. I'm going to pay you for some more custom stuff. So you go from hiring kind of an expert vendor to like maybe a labor vendor. And then the next step of the way on the continuum of hiring, if you will, would be something like a VA or a freelancer or a contractor where you're almost a pseudo employer of this type of person. And then finally, subcontractors. If you're doing an app dev practice and you're bringing in other people to do app dev underneath you to fulfill engagement, you're almost their boss in a sense. And I don't mean that in like the client is the boss sense. I mean, you're creating a relationship that sort of simulates temporary employment. And then finally, actual employees is the end of that continuum for hiring. So when you're new to hiring, it can be pretty easy to get kind of down in the weeds of advice that you'll go out and find on Freelancer forums, a lot of which is kind of trash, if I'm being honest. It's things like, always hire out if anything you're doing isn't your superpower. And that sounds like great advice, but, if you're barely paying the rent with your freelance practice, I wouldn't go out and hire someone to do marketing. I wouldn't hire a bookkeeper because, it frees you up to do your superpower more often. But is you doing your superpower going to put more money in your account? And if the answer to that is no, then hiring someone is a poor business decision. So what I would suggest in general is always be able to make a business case for the hire. So basically, if you're going to hire, say, a bookkeeper, you're going to incur an expense there. Maybe the bookkeeper wants a couple $100 a month to keep your books in good shape. You're going to save yourself some amount of time and maybe some amount of errors. With that time that you're saving, does it equal out to enough billable hours in order to justify the expense? So if you would have spent 10 hours a month doing your books, and instead of that, by paying someone $200 a month to do them probably in less time, can you take those 10 hours a month and turn them into revenue? And is that revenue more than $200? If the answer to that is yes, you've made a pretty straightforward business case. Likewise, if you could turn that 10 hours a month into drumming up additional business, so it's not directly billable hours or whatever you're charging, but you're using it to build a website and build like some lead flow into your business, it could also be a good use of time. But the thing is, it isn't just a question of, are you bad at it? It has to be a question of, would whatever you're freed up to do by saving that time benefit the business? And then on the cost side, it can also, you can make a business case for a hire. So what I mean is, let's say that through gross incompetence of your bookkeeping, you were so bad at this that you couldn't keep track of who owed you money, which meant that once every 6 months, you just lost an invoice for $10,000 and never got paid. Then you should hire a bookkeeper if it saves you from occasionally losing $10,000 to your own incompetence. That is also a business case for hiring one. But it shouldn't just be, hokum you read on Freelancer forums about like when it feels good or your zone of genius or stuff. You should be able to reason through, okay, if I make this hire, it's going to free up some of my time. It's going to stop me from making mistakes. It's going to X, and that X will lead to a better than return on the spend I'm making for this thing. So that's generally the rule of thumb for making a hire. And I guess another framework that I'll start to work bookkeeping back into here is typically when you're going into business for yourself, starting a practice and then building towards like, running a full-on business, there is kind of a hierarchy and order of which you do things that you might outsource. So I was alluding to this a little earlier, but like one of the first things you want to outsource is taxes. Another common one would be if you have any things for which you absolutely require an attorney. So I've alluded to this in other videos I'll link on YouTube. But I am not really a big believer in contracts. I think they're kind of useless. It's more about posture. Anyway, I'm not a big believer in that. But if you find yourself in a situation where, let's say, a client is saying they'll engage with you, but only if you create like a client contract, that might be the kind of thing where you say, yeah, I guess I could go onto LegalZoom and download a template and do this myself, but you're not an expert in this, and if you need expertise, go to the experts. So they're, typically for a freelancer, that's going to be high-end services with high stakes, tax prep, legal, if you were to get sued, especially legal, things of that nature. So that's really where you're going to go first. The next thing I think that people tend to farm out is stuff that they really don't like. Now that can or cannot be a good business decision, but often it correlates with good business decisions, because if you take something that you hate, like let's say cold outreach or real like toil type of data entry work or something, and for a lot of people, bookkeeping would fall into this category. You may not be particularly good at these things, but they may also suck you dry and make you want to bang your head into a wall. And that has a very real impact on your productivity that goes beyond just the time you're spending doing those things. So if every day you get up and you tell yourself, I got to rise and grind and send, cold outreach to at least 40 people, and then half of them write you back and tell you that they want you to die, that's misery inducing. And the misery of that will last and persist beyond just the 2 hours or whatever you spend in the morning. So you can very realistically look at those types of activities as dragging your whole business down. So you can generally make a decent case and an earnest case for farming them out, because you are, as a freelancer, you're the owner of a business, and you're also the sole employee of it. And if you look at it as the business owner, these are activities that are absolutely torpedoing the morale of your most important / only employee, and that's not good business. So typically, and often justifiably, you'll hire out kind of the worst things, the things you're the worst at, the things that make you the most unhappy. But you should, also make a business case that stuff needs to happen. So for instance, do you actually need to be doing a bunch of cold outreach? Maybe you can just use your network. So you can try to eliminate those tasks, but if you can't eliminate them, those can be some of the, after the stage of outsourcing the expert high stakes stuff, that can be the next to go. And then, another category might be things that are more nice to haves, or things that you would like to do but lack the time to do. Once the business is better, if you're earning more profit, you can start to look at tasks like that. And those tend to be the next to go. And slowly but surely, you'll work your way towards outsourcing everything if your practice is very successful, everything other than service delivery. So you might outsource the marketing, you might hire someone to help with sales, you might get rid of those things. And in a sense, like actually using a platform like Upwork is a weird version of outsourcing sales, marketing, and half of your business without paying for it, because you're the product rather than the vendor. But anyway, that's kind of the spectrum of hiring that will typically happen. And then once you've sort of outsourced everything else and you're delegating that and you're profitable, you might start to hire for and delegate some of the stuff that you do and as part of your value prop, with people also helping you with that underneath you, so to speak. So when you think about hiring a bookkeeper, where that's going to fit in, as I mentioned, it's for a lot of people, it's going to be toil. I never really minded it. I got in the habit of keeping personal books at a very young age. So when we started businesses, I was actually the bookkeeper of DeadTech the whole time it existed. And it was maybe a year or half a year of Hit Subscribe where I was the bookkeeper, and then we eventually did hire that out. But for me, that was fine. It wasn't really toil. It wasn't my favorite thing. But for you, something to ask yourself is, one, how bad are you at it? And two, how much is it toil? And then you might, shift that earlier into the spectrum of hiring things out. So I would, to kind of recap with that, the time where you should start to look at hiring out your books. So the question, like, when should you do this as a freelancer? I would say, number one, anytime you have the sense that you might be making mistakes or things might be slipping through the cracks, you might be getting things wrong, and it could theoretically be costing you money, or even client relationships. If you keep forgetting you send an invoice to clients and you're annoying them. So if it's causing problems in your business, that's a good sign that it might be time to think about a hire. Otherwise, if it's kind of a time sink and it would really behoove you so that you could have more billable hours, or so that you could drum up more business, if it would behoove you to get that off your plate, that's another good time. Now, when either of those things occur, you don't just want to make an automatic hire. Then you go sit down and make that business case and say, can I justify this, or am I just kind of being opportunistically lazy and saying, like, I'd sure like to not have to do that, which, by the way, is not necessarily some kind of business sin. If you're just doing it because you're lazy or because you hate it and you have the personal disposable income to do it, go ahead. It's people hire babysitters and nannies and house cleaners and stuff, and there's no business case for that. It's just that, I don't want to do these things. So if you can, on the personal side, afford it, you can always, jump the gun a little here. But that's the moment at which I would evaluate this if I were in your position. Two things I'll say philosophically to round out the content here. Number one, if you're worried about this, don't worry about this. In either direction, this is going to be such a small decision. It's just not going to matter that much in the grand scheme of things. A freelancer's books are so simple that any bookkeeper you find, number one, a VA could probably do it. But if you go with like a firm or somebody whose background is bookkeeping, they'll probably be able to keep your books in like 2 hours a month. So on the expense side of things, you're just not talking about a significant expense for this to be done for you. And then if you opt not to do it, the stakes are going to be low-ish, I would argue, just because it's going to be pretty hard to mess this up. All you really need to do is make sure you're tracking your expenses in some capacity, and make sure you're tracking what clients owe you and whether you've collected that or not. And that's really all you need to do. So in either direction, I would not lose sleep over this. Whatever you choose to do, it's going to be fine. And then finally, because a lot of you out there watching me or watching this are probably software engineers, please, and I cannot stress this enough, please do not automate whatever pigeon thing you dream up. Do not start with a spreadsheet and then think, I ought to build a web app for this. Do not do that. This problem has been solved so many times in such simple, cost-effective ways. There is absolutely never a case for you to automate this. Please get it out of your head right now. Do not think about automating, sending reminders to clients. Do not think about writing code to like track this or create a general ledger. This is one of the easiest, most attractive nuisances in terms of reinventing the wheel. Don't do it. I promise you, anything you think you need done when it comes to your books is a long since solved problem. Do not automate this. I can't stress that enough. So hopefully that makes sense. Do you need a bookkeeper to freelance? Absolutely not. But if you can make a business case for one because your practice is robust or complex enough, or you're just that bad at your books, then you might think about it, but you shouldn't need one. The time to hire one is when the time it frees up, it could be dedicated to you making your business more revenue generating and profitable. So hopefully that answers the question, and I will catch you all next time.